Evening, one and all. I'm here to finish off the Book of Ezra with you, which is a rather short book, it has to be said. I'm Father Alexander, this is St. Peter's in Hove, and I think it's our 121st step in our walking tour through the Bible. We've got basically two chapters in Ezra to consider, chapter 9 and chapter 10. No, actually, yes, chapter 9 and chapter 10. Now, not a lot happens in these chapters. Ezra discovers that many of the exiles, the people who've come back from exile, have married foreign women. And he is very, very upset by this. He sees it as an offense and a crime against God. He sits down in a stupor and mourns over the sins of Israel. Then he organizes, if you like, a national survey to find out who's married whom and to judge what should be done and to judge who should put their wives and children away, send their wives and children away. After this is done, after a few months of going through all the marriages in Israel, a whole load of women are and their children are packed off and sent out of the Israelite community. And then the book ends with a list of the guilty. These are all the people who married foreign women. So you have chapter 10, verse 18. Among the priests who were found to have married foreign wives were, of the sons of Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and his brothers, 1, 2, 3, 4, who agreed to send their wives away. Their guilt offering was a ram from the flock for their guilt. Of the sons of Immer, blah and blah, and so on. It gives a list of the guilty people. Now, something rather strange is going on here, because while we know that today in modern Judaism, marrying in is considered essential and marrying out is considered a disaster, indeed, if a woman, a Jewish woman, marries a Goy, if she marries a Gentile, her family, if they're very strict Jews, will treat her as dead and sit Shiva for her. That is to say, they will sit for 7 days in mourning with ripped garments and torn hair, just as indeed Ezra sits on the ground with his garments torn and his hair dishevelled as a sign of mourning. That person has left the community, in other words. But if you go back to the book of Genesis, and if you will find, of course, that Isaac had to marry his cousin Rebekah, and so on. In other words, endogamy, marrying in, was highly praised. But exogamy, marrying out, passes without comment. Moses married the Zipporah, the daughter of the priest of Midian. The priest of Midian certainly wasn't Jewish, and he certainly wasn't the priest of the Lord Most High. He was a priest of some local god. So that happened. Again, the very famous Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David, was a Moabitish woman. And nobody said, oh my goodness, this is terrible, marrying a woman from Moab. In fact, Ruth is absolutely admired. And then do you remember we did have the utterly admirable figure of Rahab, the prostitute, who also was a native of Jericho. She wasn't Jewish, but she sort of came on board. She realized that the Jews were going to win, or the Israelites were going to win, and therefore she embraced the Israelite religion, as presumably did Ruth. But they weren't, to start with, of Jewish faith. They were not Israelites. So Ezra represents a tightening of the rules, shall we say. Now, let's look back at the whole book of Ezra, which isn't very long. What you see in the book of Ezra, I think some people would say, is the institutionalization of Jewish worship, the codification of the organization of the temple, the bureaucratization of the temple. You have all these letters going back and forth from the Persian authorities to the Israelite authorities and back and forth saying, well, some people are trying to stop the temple, but we have a decree from the king saying we can go ahead. Here's another decree from the king saying, no, you can't go ahead. In other words, and some people would say the fossilization of religion, or possibly even the growing inflexibility of religion, particularly with this sending away of the foreign wives, who presumably were practicing the Israelite faith, maybe. Yes, I can see why people would say that. But the church too has undergone a period and a process of institutionalization. The church started off with the 72 disciples of Jesus in the upper room. But the church from the beginning was hierarchical because they were the 12 and then there were the other disciples. And similarly, the people of Israel from the beginning had a law. Indeed, Israel is founded, you could say, by the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments. So the idea that everything was free and easy, everything was charismatic, should we say, everything was the Spirit blowing where it wills at the beginning, and then the Spirit gets snuffed out by the bureaucracy, not altogether the case. The other thing is we have to have bureaucracy simply because if we're going to have things like institutions and buildings and property, then we have to have administration of buildings and property. Again, if we're going to have a hierarchy, let's say we're going to have priests and scribes and bell ringers and temple people, temple servants and Levites and so on, just as nowadays we have bishops, priests, deacons, cardinals, and so on. We have religious, male and female, we have monks, and we have apostolic religious. We're going to have a way of administering that system. If we're going to have liturgy, we're going to have liturgical law. This is not a bad thing. Ezra should not be seen as a villain. Ezra should be seen as a hero because his legalism safeguards the community from falling apart. And indeed, his strict interpretation of the law puts, if you like, a safeguard around the community of Israel, keeping out that which would, if it entered, destroy it. Now, this is very important. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The other thing about all this is that legalism has often been criticized by our Protestant brethren, particularly Martin Luther. In my humble opinion, the Reformation didn't really begin with Martin Luther nailing his theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, though that's generally when people celebrate Reformation Day. He may never have done that, by the way, but even if he did do it, it's a perfectly legitimate thing for a Catholic to do. 52 points for debate, or whatever they are, or 52 ideas. You're allowed to have ideas. This was part of the tradition of the church to have what's called a disputatio on an idea, to see whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Somebody would say this, then somebody would say, sed contra. However, on the other hand, then they'd try and find some middle way and some sort of thesis that would satisfy all sides. Now, Martin Luther's Reformation happened when he burnt the books of canon law and saying, out with canon law. It's got nothing to do with Christ. Christ has come to liberate us from the law. But the trouble was, Martin Luther soon found that he had to write his own canon law. And indeed, the Anglicans, in abolishing Catholic canon law, had to come up with Anglican canon law, which exists to this day. We have our canon law, which is remarkably simple when you consider what a huge institution the Catholic Church is. Legalism is important because there are two reasons why it's important. First of all, it's a safeguard. Let's say you have a lovely house, as indeed do I, and some people come in and say, we're taking this house over. And you say, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. And they'll say, oh, you're being very legalistic, aren't you? Oh, don't you believe that, everything belongs to everybody else and so on and so forth, freedom and love and so on? No, you say, I have the title deed to this house. I'm entitled to have this house. You're not. Please go. Legalism is very, very important. Legality is very important. The other thing, legalism tends to be a bad word. Legality is a better word. The other thing about legality is it tells us this is allowed and this isn't allowed, and there is a dividing line between the two. Ezra is somebody who tells us that there is this clear line and we can tell the difference between the two. Sometimes we don't know where the line is, but that there is a line should not be in doubt. So this scribe, Ezra, has left us a lasting heritage. So, for example, you know when a priest is properly ordained, and you know when somebody who claims to be a priest isn't a priest because he hasn't been properly ordained. You know I'm a Catholic priest. You know that certain other people who claim to be Catholic priests simply aren't. You know that baptism, when it's properly celebrated, is valid. And you will know too what constitutes a valid and invalid baptism. You can say, well, no baptism has taken place. He didn't use water. No baptism has taken place. We can find out whether a marriage is valid or a marriage is not valid. We never say, oh, well, who knows, oh, we've got no way of knowing. No, we can know. Sometimes it's very difficult, but we can know. So we know what is true, what is not true, what is valid, what is not valid. There is certainty in religious matters. This is, I think, the great inheritance we've received from people like Ezra, the idea of certainty and clarity in religion. It's completely wrong to see religion as a fuzzy sort of thing. Rather, religion is clear. And indeed, it's as clear, St. Thomas Aquinas would have us believe, as any other intellectual science, any other intellectual discipline. So let's be grateful to Ezra. He wasn't rigid, he wasn't inflexible, he was firm, he was fair, and he was clear. Oh, how I do love clarity in religion. So should we all, because the human mind is built for clarity. Nobody ever goes to a priest and says, oh, can you just give me a vague idea about what all this is about? And then they say, tell me, Father, what should I believe about X? And the priest, if he's any good as a priest, will tell you exactly what you can believe about X, because only clear ideas can be accepted or rejected. And God speaks to us with perfect clarity. Ezra's a great chap. Next time, we'll be going on to Nehemiah. Okay, all the very best then. Have a lovely evening. Goodbye.